Welcome back to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Throughout the year, we're looking at the issues and innovations that are prominent in our work as we celebrate our 75th anniversary. We started as the Lincoln Foundation in 1946. In the last show, the topic was climate change. Today, we'll focus on another of our strategic goals, reducing poverty and spatial inequality. Joining me is a very special guest who has an incredible perspective on housing and affordability, Ingrid Gould Ellen, the Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and the Faculty Director at the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. She has a number of accomplishments, but she's front of mind for us at the Lincoln Institute recently because she co-authored our new policy focus report, Through the Roof: What Communities Can Do About the High Cost of Rental Housing in America. She teaches courses in microeconomics, urban economics, and urban policy research, and is author of Sharing America's Neighborhoods: The Prospects for Stable Racial Integration, and The Dream Revisited: Contemporary Debates About Housing, Segregation, and Opportunity. She's held visiting positions at MIT, HUD, the Urban Institute, and the Brookings Institution, and she joins us today from New York City. Professor Ellen, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with a big picture at this stage of where we are in February of 2021, slowly emerging from the worst days of the pandemic, which of course laid bare all the economic and racial disparities and the longstanding affordability crisis that you write about. What was most starkly revealed by COVID and all of the events of the past year from your perspective?
That's a good question. I would say that the crisis, first of all, not only highlighted many dimensions of racial and economic inequality, but it also exacerbated them, whether from disease exposure and severity, job and income losses, educational outcomes for children, and housing too. Housing's a part of this. At the most fundamental level, you think about the key mechanism, right, that we were given to protect ourselves from this virus was to shelter in place. But many low-income households don't have safe, secure housing where they can shelter in place and where their children can study free from distractions. At the most fundamental level, the crisis highlighted that housing inequality. And it also highlighted, I think, how close so many households and renters are in particular to losing their homes. And as we show in the report, we've seen a dramatic increase in the amount of income and the share of income that households spend on their housing costs. Between 1960 and 2016, the share of renters that are rent burdened or that pay more than 30% of their income on rent, that's the standard measure, rose from about a quarter to nearly a half, right? So that's really a sea change. And that secular kind of decline in affordability over these decades has meant that it's very difficult for renter households to put aside any savings for a rainy day, much less a global pandemic. With these high housing cost burdens, even small shocks to income or expenses can put households kind of over the edge and put them at risk of eviction and foreclosure. Research also shows that renters of color are much more likely in February of 2021 to be behind on their rent. And that's partially because they came into the crisis with higher rent burdens, but it also is because they were hit harder by the job losses and the income losses that were generated by the crisis.
Yeah, it's really sense of being on the edge. And also, as you point out in the report, this is a problem that's been brewing for a long time. You point out that between 1960 and 2016, median income rose by about 11%, while the median rents rose by 80%, which you aptly characterize as some pretty cruel math. Looking at the roots of this challenge, how did we get so out of balance?
So, you would think as someone who studies housing policy and housing economics that I would have a simple answer to that question. But I actually think it's a real puzzle. I think that the factor that's most talked about and driving the affordability crisis is land use regulations. And I think there's now considerable research showing that restrictive land use regulations help to drive up housing costs and rents as they make it more costly and difficult for developers to respond to increases in demand for housing in particular locations. So I think, at least we were persuaded from reading all this literature that supply restrictions matter. But much of the writing and discussion on affordability challenges and the affordability crisis kind of stops there. And we argue that there are other factors that have contributed as well. And we actually we have a full chapter of the report, chapter 3, that lays out these additional factors. One, for instance, is just limited land in built up areas. So housing is different from other goods in that you can't just, it requires land, which means it's not as easy to expand housing production like, you can expand the production of face masks. You can't just magically produce more land, as those of you at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy know well. And some areas just have limited land, which is going to drive up both land costs and construction costs as developers are sort of forced to build potentially taller buildings. So that's number one. I'd say number two is that there's some suggested evidence that changes in the structure of the housing industry have also increased cost. And that both increasing demand from private equity and global investment firms for housing has led to greater pressure for profits and therefore higher increases in rents. There's also some evidence that the home building industry has become more concentrated. And so there's less competition to drive innovation and lower costs. In both cases, we need more research, I think, to really understand these roles of these changing structures. But I think there's reason to believe they've played a part. On the demand side, we've seen rising income inequality, the disappearance of manufacturing and other middle skill jobs that have contributed to affordability challenge for those with less education, with lower incomes, as basically sort of operating cost increases have outpaced gains in income. And also, as the wealth distribution and income distribution is skewed, you have more high income and high wealth households that are bid up the price of housing, that if supply can't respond, then the price and rent increases are going to persist and squeeze the budgets of middle and moderate income households. So it's also true that, with shrinking middle class, developers no longer have the same incentive to build for middle income households. And they're going to much more likely target higher income households and build kind of high end housing, which are going to take longer to filter down to lower income households. And then I'd say finally, I think it's important to acknowledge that while people are spending a lot more on housing, they're also actually getting more. People are living in larger, higher quality homes today than they did in earlier decades. I think the average new home now, the median new home is about 2,400 square feet, up from 1,600 in 1970. So that's, I think, part of the story too. Some of that may be also about income inequality and the sort of the norms and ideas about what constitutes an adequate home may be kind of pulled upward by the top part of the income distribution. And so keeping up with the Joneses requires more spending if the Joneses are now earning 3 times as much as you do.
You mentioned the barriers in terms of not only the restrictive land use regulations and local zoning that makes it hard to build what just intuitively seems like, well, okay, how about building some multifamily housing here next to a transit station that can support the density? And then there seems to be this persistent opposition. I think that's what frustrates a lot of people. How much of a problem is NIMBYism, this mostly local opposition that says, not in my backyard?
I think NIMBYism matters a lot. And I think while research tends to focus on the role of land use regulations, it's not just about, as you said, it's not just about the regulations themselves, but it's also about local politics and community opposition. And the fundamental kind of political challenge is that the benefits of higher density housing are likely to be widely distributed, while the costs are likely to be very concentrated and borne by nearby residents. And so as a result, these potential losers, the nearby neighbors, are far more likely to sort of show up at the community board and the planning board, the zoning board meetings to block development than potential winners are to show up and advocate for that development. So I think the political economy means that it's very challenging to get development done. I will also say that increasingly, we've traditionally expected opposition from wealthy homeowners in white suburban areas, but we're also now seeing growing opposition from renters in urban neighborhoods, often in low income neighborhoods. And unlike suburban homeowners who often worry that development is going to lower their housing values, these new renter NIMBY groups seem to be concerned that they charge that the development is actually going to increase their rents. These concerns are especially acute in neighborhoods that have recently seen large increases in prices and rents. The fears that that new development is going to sort of make neighborhoods more attractive to higher income households and kind of fuel gentrification and ultimately displacement. And so that it's not only difficult to build now in kind of affluent suburban communities, but also in a lot of urban neighborhoods as well.
Well, let's talk about solutions. We know that where most of the action is, mostly at the local level, and we'll talk about that next. But first, you write about this in Through the Roof. What do you see as some of the most promising policies at the federal level? And of course, now we have a new administration in place and also at the state level.
So I think the most important thing for the federal government to do is to expand the number of households that are receiving deep rental assistance, something that localities generally can't afford to provide. The number of low-income households that are not receiving assistance and that are spending more than half of their income on rent has grown substantially since 2000. So it's basically federal rental assistance just hasn't kept up with needs in the last few decades. And the Biden campaign proposed expanding vouchers and actually making them an entitlement to all low-income households. I'm not going to make a prediction here on whether that will really happen. Obviously, that's going to be challenging politically, but I certainly think there's growing interest and growing talk about expanding housing vouchers. The second most important, or actually maybe equally important set of actions would be to fund the enormous backlogs of capital needs in public housing around the country, which now total over $50 billion. And many public housing developments are in dire need of repairs. That's also something critical that the federal government could do. I think the federal government can and should also provide clear guidance and support for fair housing enforcement. I think the federal government could do more to facilitate and support effective local housing strategies by making programs easier to use and by funding technical assistance. I think states also play an important role in supporting localities. In some cases, states can help by getting out of the way and ensuring that localities are actually authorized to implement the most important local housing solutions. And for example, some states preempt localities from adopting strategies like inclusionary zoning or source of income discrimination laws that localities may see as critical to addressing their affordability challenges. And in other cases, however, it might be helpful for states to play a more active role. And in states where some localities have severely restricted new development through land use regulations, overrides of local zoning ordinances like Massachusetts 40B or fair share requirements can potentially change the political equation, forcing people to sort of focus more on kind of citywide or regional housing needs. So I realize that verges on saying sort of that states should allow the policies I like and limit the policies I don't like, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, certainly state governments have such an important role to play, either getting out of the way, yes, but perhaps a mix of carrots and sticks. Let those local governments now, so we're at the level of local governments. What can they do? You write about some policies that the Lincoln Institute has helped nurture over the years. You mentioned inclusionary housing, the idea of the density bonus, and also community land trusts, which I'd be interested to hear you talk about a little bit. Just what kind of incentives and changes in the rules, if you will, might have the most impact in reducing those barriers and getting more housing built?
Let me just start by saying that on the one hand, that, when I talked about sort of the causes of the affordability crisis, they're pretty macro, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing that localities can do. One of the arguments in this report is that there's a lot actually that localities can do. And I think many of the policies you mentioned can be critical strategies to help address affordability challenges. And if I can back up a bit, we suggest that localities adopt what we call a comprehensive and balanced approach to creating local housing strategies. And that so we argue that localities should invest in creating affordable housing, but also develop a local housing strategy that includes these and a range of policies. Specifically, we argue that every locality should adopt a local housing strategy that includes policies from each of four different buckets or categories. And one is creating and preserving affordable housing units, dedicated affordable housing units. Two is reducing barriers to new supply. Three is helping households access and afford private market homes. That's more kind of on the demand side. And four is to protect against displacement and poor housing conditions. So I think that it's important both for localities to sort of think about their housing strategies, ensure that they have policies sort of addressing in each of these pillars. We think that both makes for more effective policies, but also policies that are most likely to succeed politically.
Well, let me ask you about one specific change in policy, and we've seen this in Minneapolis and a number of cities across the country, and that's ending single-family only zoning so that multifamily housing, even if it's this so-called gentle density of 2 or 3 family residential structures, can technically be built anywhere in a given community. And that's not the case in so many communities now. This seems like it's a kind of an unwinding of some longstanding practices. Should more communities look at that?
It's pretty striking, I think, that we've seen movements towards gentle density in states like Oregon and California to push to, end single family zoning or allow accessory dwelling units as of right. And I think that you're right. What's sort of appealing here is these are, on the one hand, each of them individually is they're going to lead to incremental changes in communities, but collectively, they can lead to significant increases potentially in housing and in affordable housing. And hopefully, as these policies unfold and are adopted, residents will start to see and feel more comfortable that these incremental increases in density don't dramatically undermine the character of their neighborhood, even though collectively they can really make a difference in moving the needle on supply. That said, so I think these are really, I think this is sort of hopeful seeing these trends, but zoning reform again is only one part of, I think, what needs to be sort of a comprehensive approach, and that we also need tenant protections. We also need efforts to help households reach, especially households of color, reach a broader range of neighborhoods. And of course, there are divergent market conditions, right? So what works in one community may not be as critical. It may not be as critical to implement these kind of gentle increases in density in softer markets.
Now, finally, in Through the Roof, you also talk about the benefits of a regional approach. You cite the Chicago area as one place where there's more collaboration across a larger landscape of cities and towns. That brings up another dimension of the COVID crisis, sort of back to where we started. If more people are working remotely, they don't have to be in expensive cities. It may actually make struggling post-industrial legacy cities more attractive places to live. So do you see that trend possibly as a kind of a relief valve for affordability?
It's certainly possible that remote work could be part of the solution to regional divergence, and that would be welcome, since I think the consequences of this regional divergence have been harmful for both the superstar cities that have increasingly suffered from high housing costs, but also those living in the cities that have been more left behind from the population and economic growth. And I think that divide may have contributed to political polarization as well. So it's possible, but I don't think this trend, the continuation of this trend, is a foregone conclusion. I'm sitting, I'm sitting in downtown in Manhattan right now. So maybe I have a skewed view, but I don't think that these large cities are dead. I still think they're going to be attractive places to live and work. I'm also sitting in my office right now. I really like working in my office. So I don't think we can assume that remote work is going to solve our affordability and inequality problem. So I'd say that sort of policymakers are not off the hook. I think another concern is that some of the places that we're now seeing strong interest from remote workers might not have the development capacity to quickly add more housing. So you might start to see rapidly escalating housing costs in places like Montana, right, which would have seemed unlikely even a year or two ago.
Well, Ingrid Gould Ellen, thank you for joining us on the Land Matters podcast. The report is called Through the Roof, and it's available on our website, lincolninst.edu. The research is a great addition to our work on spatial equity and affordability, and part of the many major issues and policy innovations we'll be taking a look at throughout the year as we celebrate our 75th anniversary. You can learn more about how we're both looking back to our origins and looking ahead by going to lincolninst.edu, and it's right there on the homepage. Just click through to our 75th anniversary page to check it all out. And be sure to scroll all the way to the bottom of the page. That's where you can register to be part of a special virtual event that's coming up, the March 11th premiere of The Life of an Idea, an original film production about our origins and the seeds that have been planted over the years for what we're calling groundbreaking solutions. Stay up to date by following us on Twitter. The handle is @LandPolicy. And that's it for this episode of the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.